These are Grey Knights. They are one of my favorite factions and play a vital role in the lore of 40k. But there's one major problem with this box, and that it's filled to the brim with outdated models. The Librarian in particular is now over 12 years old and no longer available for sale, as there's technically a newer model. I didn't just want to grab the new Librarian and paint him silver, I wanted to capture some of my favorite features about the old one, while also making him feel a lot more like a Grey Knight, and adding a few of my personal twists along the way. There are a magnitude of things I dislike about the new Librarian, but the chin strap head probably is the first thing that has to go. Fortunately, the Paladin squad contains the perfect head that is almost an identical match to the old Librarian, but a part of me did consider going with the Paladin helmet. The book icon at the top is probably the most noticeable and probably my favorite feature about the old model. However, the connections for it are incredibly flimsy. So in order to remedy that, I cut away a portion of the Terminator armor itself. As the quality of the plastic improved over the years, it has also led to some of these connections being a lot thinner. As a result, being as clumsy as I am, I do often accidentally break them. To ensure a perfect connection, I made sure to sand in the exact roundness of the Terminator armor, when I noticed that the back section had almost an identical connection. This gave me the idea to reuse the hip cloak, which was far more challenging than I anticipated, as this was an old type of push-to-fit model that had several of the pieces molded together. I removed the back plate of the Terminator armor and cleaned up the connection, expecting that now it was gonna fit pretty well. When I went to dry fit the two pieces together, it was clear that there was a lot more plastic than I anticipated. I'll need to carve away this entire leg section, for which I'll need the dust maker. As my nickname for it would suggest, I was creating a large amount of sharp plastic dust by making very little progress. When I was working on my Tyranid battlesuit, I noticed the stone polishing tool was quite effective at higher PM. Rather than simply sanding it, it was heating up the plastic just enough that it was becoming malleable. And even though the progress was pretty good, I somehow created a tiny little hole. It's a bit unfortunate, but it's not really a problem, and I'm not even gonna bother fixing it as it's barely noticeable, unlike this plastic shrapnel. With this section nearly done, I carved away a small portion of the Terminator armor in order to make sure that the cloak went in much smoother, and removed the little bit of plastic that was catching on the leg. By removing the portion of the backplate, I also created this very massive hole that I now need to fill in with some green stuff. It is mostly obscured by the hip cloak, however I do want to make sure that even though it'll be slightly visible, that I do a decent enough job of sculpting a portion of the armor. While I had the green stuff out, I thought it'd be a good idea to attach the hip cloak using this rather than sprue glue. As the connection is the furthest thing from perfect, this will make sure that it is actually sturdy enough and during painting doesn't accidentally snap off. I cleaned up the green stuff around the area and then for the underside of the model made sure to create as thick of a connection as possible. And as much effort as this took, I think it looked absolutely phenomenal, and not only that, it somehow ended up perfectly matching the pose of the Terminator. Now I even felt confident enough to finally attach the book relic at the top. The connection was the furthest thing from perfect, however I felt confident enough that I could probably drop this model a few times and not accidentally snap it off. Now I was gonna attach the staff, but as I'm making a Grey Knight, I thought giving him a halberd would be a lot more interesting. Unlike normal weapons, Grey Knight force weapons actually use a portion of their psychic power in order to empower them. To hold the staff, I'll use the new Terminator arm with the Storm Bolter. When making the cut, I also did my best to avoid cutting the little brace. As I knew getting the pose was going to be a little bit difficult, I used a little bit of green stuff in between the connections so that as I'm moving the arm around, I can figure out the exact pose. There's quite a few Grey Knight artworks that all reference the exact same pose that I was trying to match. As the artworks in 40k are often a massive inspiration for everybody, not to mention getting people excited and getting interested in the hobby itself. So I did my best to create a tiny little homage to that theme. When sculpting the green stuff, I tried to prioritize making sure the connection was secure rather than trying to create something that looked visually good. Now, something you don't see on a Librarian is a Power Fist. Now, they aren't supposed to have Power Fist, but I just imagine a Librarian using some sort of a special psychic attack powered up along with a Power Fist, and that just looked incredible. So while there are Grand Masters and Grand Marshal, this guy will be known as the Grand Fister. As a bonus, I also gave him a tiny jousting shield, which looks cool. Now, while I left the green stuff to dry, I kept thinking that I missed something very important about a Grey Knight, and of course, it was the wrist-mounted bolter. Fortunately enough, the Paladins did come with an extra one. When I started painting him, I primed him in a very dark steel color, and slowly added just a little bit of chrome to do a zenithal highlight. Then to add a bit of definition to all of those panels, I used my favorite acrylic wash to essentially go over. Then, as I always use a varnish to secure it in the wash, I actually ended up using a special metallic varnish, which surprisingly worked really well, as the metallic paint was not affected whatsoever. Once I finished working on my golden trim, I moved on to selecting a few of the panels in black, before starting my work on the red cloak. And while I was painting the model, I also ended up listening to the audiobook called Grey Knight's True Name, which was surprisingly really good. It was a relatively short 30-minute story, but it actually captured the entire essence of the Grey Knights in the perfect way. Not to mention, it's always quite incredible to see just how creative some writers get when trying to describe a Psyker battle. It's always a hilarious contrast to the tabletop, where they're essentially just throwing lightning bolts. As I was painting the books and all the purity seals, I did want to create a much less bright and a much more aged appearance for them. So I mixed up just a little bit of Skeletal Horde with a very large amount of Flow Improver, which was coming a little bit concentrated, but once it dried, it looked a lot more subtle and just much better overall. Then I came back with the exact same diluted warm gray, but this time just glazing it on. I did have a bit of a struggle with the back cloak, and I tried a lot of different variations, until I finally had a pretty cool idea. I built up a very nice texture and then came in with an airbrush, using Blood Angel's Red to create a smoother transition but also generate some of these shadows. Now, initially, I did question why Games Workshop chose to go with essentially a blue tint over the armor, but then it sort of hit me. Looking at my model, it felt incredibly flat because most of the colors were warm. There were literally no cold hues present anywhere in the armor, and it finally dawned on me that I have to follow in their footsteps and add a little bit of blue ink on my armor. But to avoid an overpowering blue color, I made sure to glaze on a very subtle and thin layer. On the painting day, my hands were particularly shaky, so I did consider not painting any letters on the book, but I thought I'd give it a go. It was nowhere near as thin or as clean as I would want it, but it's better than nothing. Then I worked on some final details, trying to create a few extra highlights on some of the reds, as well as the white colors. I also debated whether I should give the cloak a silver or a gold trim, so of course I settled on the black. Then, to avoid it looking overly flat, giving it a very nice and subtle gray highlight. While I was painting the Nemesis halberd, I also realized that there was actually those extra little psychic tubes that I could paint in blue and balance the model even further. Then I did my best to sort of create the idea that there was these lightnings inside of the weapon, for which I mixed a bit of turquoise with a dark sea blue and then mixed in with a 50-50 ratio, slowly working my way to the pure turquoise and then finally finishing it off with just a bit of turquoise plus white. And as the final detail on the entire thing, I ended up having the idea of using a little bit of chrome as essentially a glaze to highlight some of the edges. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, and let's see the final result. And if you enjoyed this, consider watching this other video, it's also pretty good.